So intersectionality, as we discussed, right, is this intersection of our social identities and how they're layered. And it's not enough to just have a list of our identities, right? It's we can't tease them apart. Who we are is who we are, and those layers are closely connected together, right? So we have to be aware of how that plays a role in our navigating these systems. But in looking at intersectionality as well as the articles that we're reading or exploring, we will be talking a lot around like disability and race and ethnicity, and all of these different identities, right? And one thing that I want to touch upon is this idea of race and ethnicity, as well as culture and differentiating them for the purpose of this class. So race, ethnicity, and culture are all three different concepts. There is overlap, and nobody's, saying that there's not, but they are different concepts. And it's important because a lot of times there is a misconception of cultural norms being the same across all people of all races or all ethnicities, and this kind of assumption within that. So when we're talking about race can be seen kind of as this like larger umbrella term, and race is fluid. And when I say race is fluid, and it's socially constructed, it means that over time it has changed. So in terms of the history of the United States, we can see that race has been weaponized in many ways. So, in terms of what it meant to be "quote unquote" American, it meant that you, at one point, the government did recognize that race was a social construct, and they associated it with American values. So, like this idea of whiteness and American values went hand in hand from a governmental perspective. It was like dressing a certain way and behaving a certain way and upholding certain values. But what ended up happening is that when folks of color and immigrants started upholding those values, it then suddenly was shifted and said, oh, well, actually, no, race is more of a biological basis. So we can see that racial categories have been weaponized in order to uphold different kind of situations and scenarios. So race tends to be associated with perceived physical characteristics. A lot of people think about genes and genetics because it has to do with these perceptions, but we also know that different physical characteristics can be similar across people who might have different racial categorizations. There is an overlap around, like kind of ethnic groupings and race, but they're not the same. And again, race is more of a larger umbrella. So for sociologists, we're looking at race kind of within this general definition. Race is a category of people who have been singled out as inferior or superior on the basis of real or alleged physical characteristics, such as hair texture, eye shape, and other attributes. When I say as sociologists, let me backtrack that historically, we're looking at the social and political conditions within it. That does not mean that inherently somebody is that way, but rather our society has been looking at it. It comes at it from a perspective of looking at structural oppression, right? Structural issues. The idea is that there is this dynamic between those in positions of power and those that are not. And rooted in this kind of anti, well, it's very pro-white and anti-people of color perspective. So when we're looking at race and ethnicity, we have to see that they go together, but they're often confused with each other because race is kind of this larger umbrella term. Ethnicity does have to do more with geography. That doesn't necessarily mean your own personal geography, but it has to do with like kind of origin, like geographic origins. Like can be like your family. Culture and ethnicity can overlap, but different races can be different ethnicities, and different like multi-ethnicities can be, multiracial. You have multiracial and biracial categorization. Ethnicity. So, for example, you think about like geographic regions being kind of ethnic origins, while racial categories is kind of a larger umbrella. So we think about it in terms of like the United States. A lot of people might say that they are German or Swedish or Spanish, but that still is the large, like those are ethnic origins, but the larger racial categorization has to do with race. It becomes complicated because it's just not always that clear cut. And again, you can be different ethnicities, but be one race, and it varies, but it also changes outside the context of the United States too. We have to understand that sometimes when we're looking at different readings as well, so I do incorporate a lot of readings in this class that are wider than just the United States. But in terms of like research and understanding these concepts, right, we have to understand that how people are categorized or sorted are different. It's different outside of the United States. And these categorizations might be understood differently. So one of the examples I like to bring in on a personal level is like I recognize that racially, right? I present as white. Racially, I'm white. I have those. I can navigate the world in that capacity. But ethnically, right? Like yeah, there's a couple different like white ethnicities, like German, for instance. But I also am very closely connected to my Korean ethnicity, and I'm closely connected to my the Korean cultural background because of my mom's side of the family. So looking at those connections, right, I can identify that racially I might, sure, by some people's standards could be considered multiracial. But for me, because of perceptions, right, and how I navigate the world, that is where that kind of shapes my navigation of the world. Meanwhile, I don't deny my ethnic and cultural backgrounds within that, but that changes. We can also see, right, those racial categorizations have changed historically, where anybody who had any one particular ethnic background may have been also immediately associated with that racial group. And so I bring this up because this idea of race is a social construct, which has been mentioned, and we are familiar with this, and it's something that we have been saying for some time. But the idea of race within the categories that we know them are a social construct. However, it has very real social and political implications for the world, which is why when you think about how like maybe sociologists have looked at it that way, that's what we're looking at is the social and political implications of the world. One second. So those social and political implications are what we're looking at, is how these categories have been weaponized and used in order to maintain power over others. Um, Racism and prejudice are two different concepts. And as sociologists, we're looking at racism within the context of the structure, right? Racism is very deeply rooted in this power dynamic. And it is under the idea that from a structural perspective, right, we have to understand that race was created within these social and political realms, but then at the same time that because of the weaponization of it, this racism is connected intricately to power. If you've ever heard the phrase, for instance, or like the saying, for instance, that reverse racism doesn't exist, it's not denying that prejudice exists, and that's not it at all. It's the idea that racism is deeply connected to power and the structure. That's where that's coming from. It's not saying that it's okay. It's not saying that individual issues around that prejudice, that it's not saying that those aren't okay. It's just saying that we have to be aware of the structural elements at hand. Racism is a structural element. Prejudice can happen toward anybody negatively and have very real negative impacts toward people as well. Okay, so Peggy McIntosh writes this thing called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And in it, she says, I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group. So sit with that for a second. And what do you think that means? And also reflect a little bit on how you were taught about racism growing up. So if you could share in the chat or unmute yourself, basically unpack this quote. What does she mean? And how were you taught about racism, whether at school or otherwise? Like, was it individual or structural? You can unmute yourself or you can type it in the chat.
I think that structural and systematic racism was kind of a product like of individual racism because those people came together and like created our systems that run our country. And if they have those beliefs, it's going to be reflected in those systems that they created.
I think that's a really good point, especially if we think about the idea of structure and agency. And when I talked about how a lot of times we think about structure impacting agency, but we forget about how agency can impact structure. I think that's a good point, right? Thinking about how people can come together and reinforce those structural things or create those structural elements are key. I think that's a good point. Thank you. In the chat, we have I was taught about both, specifically to Jim Crow laws in the systemic way, but taught that individual acts of meanness were a result of the Jim Crow laws. Okay, so again, looking at that interconnection of the two. Okay, very good. I think I was taught that it was both structural and individual. I remember learning about how different groups were systematically discriminated, but also how people were racist individually. Right. Okay. And I think that that's a good shift for sure. I think that a lot of times, in especially within education systems now, we're seeing there's this big move um, where we can't even talk about race. I don't mean like at the college, but I mean like education systems in K-12 across the country. I remember when I was growing up, there was this mural of diverse kids like holding hands, and it said "E-racism," as if a bunch of diverse people coming together was simply going to solve the issues of racism, as opposed to addressing the structural elements. And then in the chat, we said, I think she means that, like many others, we're only taught to see racism when it's more on a large scale hate crime rather than being told about systemic racism and microaggressions that exist on a daily basis. And then individuals are the ones passing laws, but groups thinking and beliefs help racism prevail and make it easy to continue. I think it wasn't until I was in high school and especially college that I was taught about structural racism. Primary school was mostly focused on individual racism, in my opinion. I feel like it was taught in a very black and white way when I was younger. And then let's see. Okay. And then she was taught that racism was present throughout everyday aggressions, as was unaware of the systems behind it all that are actually the ones leading cause to the aggressions. And I was taught more about systems and some about the daily aggressions, but felt I didn't know anything about meanness to racism until I moved to the US. And you see it present in Mexico too. So I think this is important. I do think it's important. And I think when we think about in terms of gender and work and labor, it's really crucial that we think about it, not just in terms of race, but like from an intersectional perspective, right? Because one of the things that you're all noting is how, right, yeah, you were taught one way and we experience these things, or maybe we're looking at the intersection of both. And this is why laws and policies and practices around supporting people who maybe have been minoritized or marginalized or oppressed, right, in these conditions are able to navigate these systems differently. One of the things that a couple of you have noted is how the individual or a group of individuals can create these systems and structures that become, problematic. So thinking about that, one of the key takeaways in this class is the way that you can advocate for yourself. Right, being able to know like I may not be an expert in policies and laws, but being able to understand peer-reviewed research as highlighting these disparities is one step to being able to advocate for yourself because it does highlight the structural problems at hand, the institutional problems at hand. Um, See, no, it says I was taught both, and I think many others would say the same. Although when we learned about systems of racism, they were more so taught as something historical rather than particularly relevant to the world around or today. And that is a really good point. That is true. We are often taught from a historical standpoint too. So for Peggy McIntosh here, her background is she did a lot of women's studies and the focus was at the time, like women's rights and supporting of that. But then she started realizing the necessity of intersectionality because of this, right? And specifically within race. Now discrimination is different because it actually involves action and process. So racism involves action and process too, oftentimes, but the actual action itself is discrimination, right? So it's pushing people out, not denying somebody a promotion, being able to fire somebody, right? That can be a form of discrimination. And this is why policies and laws are so vital in order to support, from an intersectional perspective, minoritized people in the workplace. And if we think about it from a gender perspective, because if action is discrimination, we need anti-discriminatory laws then in place. We have seen over the last year or so, many laws overturned that are workplace protections or just like institutional protection acts. And we have seen a lot of those laws overturned. And the reason that they're in place to begin with is because of the level of discrimination that has taken place in these institutional settings. Okay, I'm gonna actually go through um sorry, I know I went through this. Oh, okay. So I want to actually jump to this section of the slides though and talk about more of the type of economic structure because of how we see our actually, sorry, one second. I just want to make sure. Actually, no, I'm going to go through these kind of theoretical foundations. Um, so in the chat we have, I think also in elementary school, middle school, it's not taught very openly. It's almost as if a lot of the reality is covered up. I agree with you. I do agree. A lot of that assumption is rooted in the idea that youth aren't prepared to have that conversation or are unable to have that conversation. And of course, we want, like developmentally appropriate conversations, but at the same time, youth are a lot more ready to have those conversations. And for many people, they have to live it daily, right? They have to live that reality daily. Um, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of theoretical ideas intersecting race and the workplace and incorporating elements of gender into that. So we've talked about the three major theories, right? Functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism, and how they, if you were put on a set of lenses, right, how would you view the world that way? And from a functionalist lens, it is very, very much about assimilation, right? The key component here is assimilation. And the idea is that assimilation is what will help with creating a stable society. The biggest problem with this from a functionalist perspective overall is that if there's any discomfort, then the idea is that you should still just be fulfilling your roles. From a functionist perspective, this idea of assimilation helps minimize hostility and violence. We can see how in the workplace, though, functionalism is the dominant narrative from an intersectional perspective, because if I were to ask you right now, before I go into any of the others, when you think about professionalism and you close your eyes and I said, imagine somebody who is professional, dressed professionally, what do you picture? Like, what do you see in your mind? And you don't have to share it. If you want to share it, you can. You don't have to share it. But the reason I bring this up is that whiteness and male dominated spaces have really dictated what professionalism is, and has in turn determined a lot of those institutional and structural policies, including in the workplace. So thinking about how to dress a certain way, but perhaps you wanted to wear something that was more, important to you culturally and you weren't of like a particular group in that area, that might be frowned upon. How you wear your hair a certain way, how you do your makeup a certain way, right? All of those things have very dominant perspectives from an assimilationist idea. Just in 2021, I think it was 2021 or 2022, that if you, I don't know if you heard about this in the news. Granted, it was high school, but it doesn't matter. It's still the idea of policies and laws on what is appropriate and what is professional. There was a black male wrestler who they cut his hair off at a wrestling match because it didn't adhere to policy. So these policies are rooted very, and that was just like 2 or 3 years ago. These policies are rooted in this dominant idea, this dominant narrative. So functionalism does determine a lot of the policies and laws that we see and witness in our society. And from a functionalist perspective, the one way to minimize some of the contention and issues that we have is that people just need to get to know each other. They just need to get to know each other, and there needs to be more contact between people. But the biggest issue within that, like from this perspective, Gordon Allport is saying, is that it already assumes that there's an already equal standing. um it doesn't actually decrease or minimize like the philosophical problems that are in place. A lot of times policies and laws are put into place before cultural norms have caught up. So if we're thinking about it in the work world, we have to see how a lot of those practices and policies have been put in place because philosophically there was still significant discrimination and prejudice against women in the work world. And it's still the case, but those policies did help change some of those cultural norms and values. Okay, so conflict theory is looking at these power relations, right? And there is a very close connection between the economic and racial stratification, economic, racial, and gender stratification, 100%. The caste perspective is one theoretical kind of idea underneath conflict that would look at how racial and ethnic inequalities and as well as gender inequalities are deeply entrenched in the US, and that because of the way that the economic system really took off in the US, rooted in the enslavement of people, that it has determined this kind of caste system, and that caste system was strengthened by anti-miscegenation laws. So anti-miscegenation laws being the laws that certain groups of color were not allowed to marry white people because, of problematic purity perspectives, which was not deemed as unconstitutional until 1967. But there have been cases even as far back, I think it was like 7 or 8 years ago, of small towns disallowing interracial marriages to still exist. And so, from this caste perspective, the idea is that it is in place and it will remain in place until we have some sort of radical change. And honestly, one way to do that would be laws and policies that do explicitly address this. But we see that those laws and policies that have been put in place are slowly being overturned. Um, our class perspective is another one that we could look at and should look at because it looks at how capitalism aids in racial exploitation, but also in gender exploitation, because of how people are sorted and separated. And the class perspective also can help us understand occupational segregation to begin with. So occupational segregation being how different people are segregated in the workplace. With the Olympics most recently, there was a lot of narrative around segregation in the Olympics, and it did show a lot of deeply problematic philosophical arguments. I'm not talking about so this is between, actually, it came up with quite a few different athletes, but we can see philosophically a lot of these problematic narratives being reproduced. But we see it also in the types of work that different people take. So the assumption that nurses are women or teachers are like K-12 teachers are women. There is this kind of heightened intersection of that because that feminization also allows from a deeply misogynistic society to push for less pay. So if you work in a field that has been feminized, oftentimes it'll be less paid. Now, there are some exceptions, of course, but in general, there's still this kind of gendered perspective involved with it. Okay, so I'm going to skip some of this. Okay, so could we say that capitalism and the patriarchy at time work well hand in hand, and not just patriarchy affecting women, but I mean the ideologies that root? Absolutely. So capitalism and patriarchy do absolutely work hand in hand. So the patriarchy, as we there's a lot of misconceptions about patriarchy too. The perspective around the patriarchy is that it's like this idea that we should hate men, and that's not what the patriarchy is. So yeah, from a conflict theorist perspective, there is this interconnection of analyzing race, gender, and class because of how power is so deeply connected within them. All right, so a little bit more, and this is helpful within looking at the intersectionality that we're using in this class. So the split labor market theory is basically that our economic structure is divided and that there are different sectors. You have your primary sector and your secondary sector. Um, your primary sector are the ones that are upper tiered and higher paid. They're the ones that, people are told they want to, the jobs that they should want. They're the jobs they should thrive for. They generally have higher pay, better job security, better like working conditions, while the secondary sector are the ones that are lower paid. And some researchers have looked at this correlation between um, gender and race within these sectors, so within the primary sector and the secondary sector. But one of the key elements of the split labor market theory is also that the continued discrimination and segregation from an intersectional perspective, really that white workers tend to benefit from that because it maintains that they can be in those positions, in those primary sector positions, that there is a correlation between these sectors and that level of segregation and stratification of people, right? Thinking about it again from an intersectional perspective. And then like within racial theories, we have W.E.B. Du Bois, who looks at double consciousness, that, it's not enough to just like you have this primary identity formation, and that there is a lot of stress during your identity formation because not only do you see, because Du Bois was a Black sociologist, looks at how it's not just his identity as being a Black man or being or living in the United States, but being a Black man in white spaces living in the United States. And so you have this perspective of how you see yourself with your own eyes as well as the others. And a lot of work has been expanded within this double consciousness perspective to include from an intersectional perspective of other social identities. And when Naomi talk about race and how deeply connected it is tied to history and politics, and that there's always like racial categories create and foster some sort of competition, especially if you think about it from um, a class and gender perspective, and that this fostering of it upholds this kind of structural oppression and competition, and that race is always political, right? Race has to be seen as always political, especially because of this fostering of that competition. Okay. So looking at gender, so there's like specific focusing at gender and race. There's just the interconnection of the two. Is that we have to look at how racism can be and is gendered, and that it propels the continual exploitation of women of color in our society. So a good example is for many years we heard the saying that women make 77 cents to the dollar. It's gone up a little bit. It actually might be just a smidge higher than this now, I think, but not by much. Like if anything, it's 81, but it went up from 77 to 79. And the argument was that women made 77 cents to the dollar, or in this case, 79 cents to the dollar. But the problem with that is that that was only for white women. If you look at other factors, there are a lot of other factors that play a role in that, but specifically looking at gender and race, it's white women that make that much money. So white women make 79 cents to the dollar, Black women make 62.5 cents to the dollar, Asian women 86.8, and then Latina women 54.4. And some folks have asked me like, oh, well, why do Asian women make it higher? There's a lot of factors, social factors that can play a role in it. And I would theorize actually that a lot of it has to do with the model minority myth. Model minority myth is the assumption, and it's a myth, that there are certain minoritized individuals that are model minorities in society, model groups of color, model citizens, not from the US. And so I would actually say that that's where a lot of that stems from, or a lot of these assumptions, as well as there's a lot of history with the US subsidizing certain countries, specifically a lot of Asian countries as well, for coming to the United States to receive certain education as well in the STEM field. So there's a lot of that as well involved. But it does go to show as well the idea of race always being political, because that is politically fueled, politically supported. Um, So gendered racism pushes us to rethink some of the narratives that we have, that it's not just race, it's not just gender, right? And we really have to kind of go beyond that. And so in occupational segregation, there's a couple things that I want you to think about when you read the articles and when you start engaging these narratives is is that so if you heard the 77 cents to the dollar, the question then is that really what's happening, or do I need to dig a little deeper? Is that really what's happening, or is that just comparing white women, right? Like who is the default in those conversations? We also need to ask, why are certain people taking certain jobs? Why are only certain fields available for certain groups of people? And that's how we can start kind of critically engaging with occupational segregation. And then lastly, symbolic interactionism has to do with our meanings and experiences. Right? So like how are things socially constructed? How do our experiences inform that? And from an intersectional perspective, it's really important because in the workplace, right, we might have policies for gender, right, to support gender equality, but we have to recognize that that is only one facet of identity, right? So how a straight neurotypical white woman navigates one area might be different than, say, a neurodivergent queer Asian woman or a trans Black woman, right? So those experiences will influence how you navigate the world. But oftentimes, even though we need policies and laws in place, we should be thinking about it from an intersectional perspective so it can kind of minimize some of the potential outcomes of things that maybe are still keeping people out. So COVID-19, we all were affected by it in some capacity, right? And there is some arguments or wording around COVID-19 that has called it a she session. So thinking about a recession, right? She session though, because what we found was that, as you're kind of seeing in your readings, and we kind of maybe have experienced personally, that as a collective, as a whole, not individual circumstances, of course. Oops, for some reason it didn't send it there. Um, that what ended up happening was that there was a significant drop in access to a lot of things in terms of women in the labor and in workforce. Um, Now, I want to make note, and this is something that I will talk a little bit more about um, as we go through today, but that even though there was this she session, these discrepancies and disparities are not new. What actually I would argue is that COVID-19 actually just exacerbated kind of what we were already seeing, right? And some of the struggles and kind of misogynistic foundations that we were witnessing. So we know what COVID-19 was, right? It was a global pandemic, and it, wiped through, it did kill a lot of people. It caused a lot of structural issues. It was also the outcome of additional structural issues, right? Of like a lot of systemic problems. At this time, though, it was like we saw huge amounts of other endemics, right? We saw like we became more aware as a society of the high levels of racism, right? And anti-Blackness rooted deeply, like that was deeply embedded in many of our systems, right? So we saw, we as a society became more aware of police brutality. Not that it didn't exist before, because it absolutely did, right? But it was now broadcast in a way that we were all kind of at home for the most part. Like many people were at home, were more aware, were more kind of tuned in for a variety of reasons. There was a lot of anti-Asian rhetoric and hate crimes that always had existed as well, again, but climbed because of the systemic narratives that were being created around anti-Asian hate. There was a lot of ableism that again always existed, but was climbing at higher rates now because of the pandemic. The narratives around the idea that the loss of a disabled person wasn't necessarily as significant. There was a lot of criticism of first responders as well as teachers. So a lot of first responders, on one hand, there was a lot of like praising, right? Oh, they're heroes. But then at the other hand, there was a lot of criticism as well of first responders because either they weren't doing enough or whatever the circumstance was. And then there was a lot of commentary about teachers as well. The idea that teachers, especially K-12, because people had young children at home, there's a lot of criticism that teachers should just go back in the classroom. They just wanted to sit around at home. And I was teaching middle and high school at the time, and that was some of the most trying and challenging times of teachers' lives. And so, there was a lot of that narrative going around. It presented a lot of new challenges, but then also made challenges that we were witnessing just feel also far more significant, right? Because like this anti-science kind of narrative that we have is a huge criticism of many, doctors, for instance. There's already a negative perspective of teachers, right? So these things always existed, but during the time at the height of the pandemic, because COVID-19 still absolutely exists and still causes significant problems for people. But it's not classified as a pandemic technically anymore. But at the height of the pandemic, we saw significant new challenges being presented, right? And we saw that also the exacerbation of challenges that had already been in place. So with a lot of these structural issues at hand, it should be, unfortunately, no surprise that we were seeing situations, become worse in terms of gender disparities too. Um, so one of the things that the National Bureau of Economic Research had noticed, so this was published in 2020, and it was a rather quick response, was that COVID, they knew ahead of time, like before, right? So in the US, in San Diego anyway, we closed our physical spaces on Friday, March 13th of 2020. And we right around February, March is when places were really shutting down. And even in early 2020, the National Bureau of Economic Research had noted that COVID-19 had a huge potential to make significant impact to women with job loss. And there was a reason for it. So some of it was this already in place occupational segregation that we saw. Because COVID-19 had negatively impacted hospitality and healthcare, even though we know that there was like a ton of healthcare needs, it did mean that uh, people were being impacted negatively though, far more. And then when we also say healthcare, it wasn't necessarily just your first responders in first responders in the sense of emergent care, but other healthcare positions as well, right? So there were a lot more job losses, and this was really the first one that we saw that had the potential for negative impact for women at the significant level. That does not mean so the past ones were historically more hit male dominated fields harder. That does not mean that women were not impacted. That's not what this is saying at all, but rather that when recessions hit or that there was some sort of economic burden, it oftentimes hit male dominated fields more often than not. So in the past, for example, construction, manufacturing, trade, transportation, and utilities were fields that were often hit. There are a lot of times that these things kind of go through cycles and I say normal in parentheses, I mean, in quotations, recessions. So there is this kind of cycle. But what ended up happening is that because COVID-19 radically shut down many things that were not these historically male dominated fields, and it shut down everything that we saw that, including like government work, health and education, those were shut down in different ways. And in that case, 40% of women in government and healthcare and education versus 20% of men, right? So that's just in terms of measurement, like the amount of people that were impacted in those fields. And obviously 46 and 24 don't add up, but in terms of the amount of people that are impacted, the amount of people that are working across these different fields, we're seeing that this time there was a significant shift for women in this recession or the economic burden. But it wasn't just the closures that also impacted. So that was one, of course, but it was like as in shutting down the industries, but it was also the closures of schools and daycare centers. So as our group went on Tuesday, some of the things that they noted was this kind of despair, like this discrepancy and inequalities around gender. Um, so as the article on Tuesday noted and the group noted, was that there was a lot of and this is something we can think about philosophically. There was a lot of potential for some like radical change, right? there was a lot of potential for radical change uh, on all levels, like all systems. But what happened was it ended up just kind of, we tried to maintain the same systems that we had in place, and it just caused a lot of hardship. So there were a lot of mothers tend to provide the majority of childcare. For whatever reasons. And a lot of times it kept mothers from being able to work. So, just kind of an anecdotal situation is I was, like, as I mentioned, during this time, I was teaching high school, and I was also conducting research for one of my projects. And I was working with my school at the time. And I remember interviewing we had a very diverse group of families there, but especially the elementary school, for some reason, they had folks that came from more privileged backgrounds. And I remember interviewing families on like how we were doing well and what we were doing wrong as a school. And I remember one participant sharing that she was very fortunate. And then this also shows like kind of perspective. She was very fortunate that she had the choice to quit her job so her husband could continue working and she could stay home to stay like to help her kid do well in school. And while on one hand that does show a gender disparity, right? Like she was the one that stayed home she was the one that stayed home to help their kid. It also was a choice, right? She had the ability to make that choice. But what about the people that didn't have that choice, right? That had to continue to work. We did see that men have like historically we have been able to have more, like, just because of the types of fields, more telecommute jobs, and this was maintained and upheld still within the dynamic, and that a lot of only 20% of the single parents that were reporting on their experiences were able to telecommute. So even telecommuting, being at home with your families, with your kids, that's a lot of work. It's a lot to juggle. But that was for those who had that choice. Only 20% of people who identify as a single parent were able to telecommute from their work. And so that was a big change. Meanwhile, 40% of the people with children reported being able to telecommute, which it's an interesting dynamic, and I'm not quite sure what exactly would influence that, except, the types of industries that they're in. Um, 40%, 44% of the married couples with children had both spouses being able to work full time. But in that survey, still mothers provided at least 60% of the childcare. And again, surveys are not perfect either, right? So that only measures a certain element involved where it's those who are reporting on it, right? It's self-reported percentage. So if you ask certain people, they might say, "Oh yeah, I provide about 60 care." Even then, it's still the majority amount. Um, Studies have shown, whether it was in COVID-19 or just kind of in general as an average, that men perform an average of 7.2 hours of childcare per week versus 10.3 hours by women. Right. But if you multiply 3 hours a week, by 52 weeks, that's a large discrepancy. This is not something that's new, and I'll explain that. I'll share a qualitative study that a sociologist did in a little bit in the 1980s. Um, in the 2020 report, like, so it's estimated that 15 million single mothers in the United States will be we're going to be the most severely affected, because they weren't going to receive support from other types of childcare, and there was a smaller likelihood of being able to work, or work to the same extent during that crisis. And that's where that kind of negative criticism of teachers also came in, because the idea was like, well, I need to work. And I understand that, right? But this was also reflective of a structural problem. A lot of times we can see that, sure, on an individual level, like, it's frustrating to be able to have that struggle, but this also highlights that sociological imagination to understand a social problem, right? It's not just a private trouble. This is a social problem, a social issue at hand, that becomes a larger structural issue.